would soon strike from U-boat bases being constructed along the French west coast at Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire and Bordeaux. Admiral Karl Dönitz would set up his new headquarters just outside Lorient at Carnival. For the next year, 30 submarines would operate from these bases. The German fleet would soon be joined by 18 Italian submarines under German operational control. Luftwaffe units of Focke-Wulf Condors and Heinkel 111s would fly from airfields at Mérignac near Bordeaux and Stavanger in Norway. While at Kiel, the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were undergoing repairs and would soon be ready to sortie, as would the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer in Wilhelmshaven. The battleship Bismarck and the cruiser Prince Eugen were in trials in the Baltic and would not be ready for 6 months, but their mere presence was enough to alarm the British authorities. The Condors could strike over 1,400 kilometers into the Atlantic, almost as far as Iceland. The U-boats would patrol a wide area, initially operating to 25 degrees west, and this would steadily increase as the battle progressed. Also, the first wave of secret raiders had already set sail, and were now traveling south through the Atlantic Ocean. The capture of the French Atlantic ports not only saved the German and Italian U-boats a week's traveling time, but the new bases also proved highly effective repair yards. Normally, of the total number of U-boats in service at any one time, a third would be traveling to or from station, a third would be in dock undergoing refits and repairs, leaving only the final third actually on operations. The new French bases were far more efficient than the overworked ports of the German homeland, and the number of U-boats on operations instead of in dock would rise considerably. Even as the Germans were completing the conquest of France, Hitler had already turned his sights towards Great Britain. While the U-boats were set to cut Britain's Atlantic lifeline, the Luftwaffe began bombing her ports and channel shipping. As British naval forces had been diverted to watch the coastline for a threatened German invasion, many merchant vessels had been left defenseless. Every effort was made to help them protect themselves, and as much of the merchant fleet as possible was now given armor protection. Many merchant ships were also armed, and their crews were trained to fight. In June 1940, nearly half the Royal Navy's 80 destroyers were deployed in the screen thrown around the south coast of Great Britain to watch for a German invasion. Even more were utilized in formations called search and patrol groups. These had a roving brief to sweep the ocean for prowling U-boats. This left the Western Approaches Command responsible for the defense of all Atlantic convoys, with too few destroyers and less than 50 sloops and corvettes. The Western Approaches warships were soon to be based in the ports of Liverpool, Greenock and Londonderry. Later in the battle, Admiral Max Horton would become Commander-in-Chief with his headquarters at Liverpool. The Western Approaches warships initially could only escort the outward-bound convoys as far as 12 degrees west, 100 miles west of Ireland. At the 12th meridian, the convoy would have to continue the rest of the 4,000-kilometer journey alone, or with just light defense. The Western Approach's escorts would wait at the edge of their patrol limit to meet the more important homeward-bound convoys. There were two types of homeward sailing convoys. The faster convoys formed up at the Canadian port of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and were coded HX. The slow convoys formed up at Sydney, Cape Breton, and were coded SC. For their protection, the Royal Canadian Navy presently had less than 10 destroyers, which could only provide the convoys with a light escort for about 400 miles. In order to keep the European conflict out of American waters, the United States maintained the Neutrality Patrol out to 300 miles east, which with 8 destroyer groups and 5 Catalina squadrons was for the time being enough to deter any long-range U-boats. East Atlantic air cover was provided by less than 30 RAF Coastal Command squadrons flying from Great Britain. British and Canadian resources were stretched to the full, and even with American help, the convoys faced a huge gap in the middle of the Atlantic, with little surface and no air protection. In late May 1940, the first wave of U-boats, refitted, rearmed, and with well-rested crews, set sail for the Atlantic. Many Allied merchant ships still continued to travel independently, without the benefits of convoy protection, and so were utterly defenseless. The only hope for these independents lay in the vast emptiness of the ocean, where the sheer expanse of sea made discovery almost impossible. However, the enemy U-boats had several critical advantages. They were equipped with good radio direction finders, which pinpointed the positions of merchant radio transmits. At closer ranges, hydrophones picked up and amplified the sound of ships' engines and propellers. Just as important as the detection equipment, the U-boats often had the benefit of good air reconnaissance, and above all, they were provided with excellent intelligence. British naval radio transmissions were intercepted, and many could already be decoded, giving away convoy positions and headings. German secret agents had been placed in most ports of the British Empire, and the U-boats were told about departing vessels. In addition, American insurance companies still did business with neutral European countries, and German agents could learn the origins and destinations of particularly valuable cargoes. In June alone, the U-boats had sunk 64 merchant ships. At 261,000 tons, this was the most destructive month of the war so far. In July, even that figure was beaten, when the first of the French U-boat bases became fully operational. The devastation continued throughout August, and far outweighed Allied construction of new ships. With as yet just 30 submarines, the U-boat arm was already achieving a third of its monthly target. In the battle so far, 80% of nearly 150 merchant ships sunk had been independents, vessels sailing out of convoy. The U-boats had only to find the trade routes and pick off their victims from a predictable succession of targets. But many merchants were now sailing in convoy, which meant that the U-boat could either be deterred by an armed defense or fail altogether to intercept the ships. With vessels coming from many different ports, each convoy took a long time to form,